As part 2 of Denis Villeneuve's film Dune is scheduled to come out fairly soon, I thought it would be interesting to do a little look into the history and philosophy that inspired it, particularly that of medieval Islam. From the desert setting to the vocabulary and mysticism that permeates Herbert's work, the ethos of Dune clearly owes quite a lot to various medieval Islamic cultures. Some of the references are so on the head that they require little explanation or comparison. Much of the Freeman culture is quite obviously inspired by that of the Arab Bedouin and North African Berbers. For instance, Paul is called the Muad'Dib, prophesied to be a great leader. This is clearly lifted from the Islamic concept of the Mahdi, almost a second coming or messianic figure, who would be prophesied to take part in a battle at the end of days. Likewise, the term jihad is used repeatedly throughout Dune, in a context that is largely the same as that of the Islamic concept of holy war and spiritual struggle. In Dune, this prominently took the form of the Butlerian jihad, well before the actual events of the main story, in which humans banished advanced AI that had risen up against them. Most elements, however, are not so obvious and require a little more understanding. In the world of Dune, the Sorukar are the elite guards and shock troops of the Emperor, trained from a young age on the planet of Seleucus Secundus in all of the arts of war. In their later stages, though, they have become a bit soft from years of resting on their laurels. There is a fairly straightforward parallel with the phenomenon of slave soldiers in the historic medieval Islamic world, most notably the Mamluks of Egypt and Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire. These were usually bought as slaves from non-Muslim populations, often from the Eurasian steppes and Caucasus, and then converted to Islam and trained to be the elite fighting forces, personally loyal to a ruler. Eventually, many of them would end up seizing power for themselves. Minus the last part, the Sorukar are clearly inspired by the Mamluks and Janissaries, in that they are the loyal guards of the emperor, trained from a young age in the arts of war. There is also arguably a parallel with the spice trade in Dune, upon which the Imperium revolves, with the real-life spice trade, in which spices from Southeast Asia were transmitted across the Indian Ocean to Mamluk Egypt, and then to the rest of Europe by Venetian traders. This was one impetus for the Age of Exploration, in which Spain and Portugal sought to break this monopoly by finding a direct path to the Indies, which saw Columbus reach the Americas and Vasco da Gama's voyage to India, as well as wars between the Portuguese and the Mamelukes and Ottomans for control of spice routes in the Indian Ocean. In the end, though not a one-for-one parallel, perhaps, since spice in Dune is arguably also inspired by opium and oil, I think Herbert certainly drew inspiration from the importance of the spice trade in the early modern world for his spice guilds and navigators in Dune. In the world of Dune, the Emperor presides over the known universe with his elite Sorukar, but centuries of victory have made them become stagnant and decadent. To better understand Dune, I will have to provide a very short introduction to Islamic history. The Arab tribes became united under the banner of Islam and went on to invade their neighbors, namely the Romans and Sassanid Persians, who had become exhausted after years of fighting with one another. Although previous Arab tribes had raided into Iran, Mesopotamia, and Syria before, these were by individual groups or fractious confederations that could not achieve lasting impact. It was not until the advent of the religion of Islam that the Arabs were united enough to completely change the world political stage. In a burst of empire building not rivaled until the Spanish in the 16th century, the Arabs, united by Islam, forged an empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Morocco and Spain to the edges of India and China, even defeating a Chinese army at the Battle of the Talas River. Expansion into Gaul and attempts to take Constantinople failed, however, as did invasions of Nubia in modern Sudan. Gradually, the Arabs lost total control over the Islamic world, which they had created, as conquered peoples, such as the Iranians and North African Berbers, began to convert en masse, while fighting amongst the Arab Muslims themselves resulted in importation of slave soldiers from beyond the frontiers of the Arab Islamic world, most notably from various Turkic peoples, with the goal of creating a military class purely loyal to their masters, as they would not have a pre-existing stake in Arab Muslim society. Writing near the end of the Islamic Golden Age, in the 14th century, the brilliant Arab historian Abd al-Rahman Abu Zayd ibn Muhammad ibn Khaldun, better known as just Ibn Khaldun, sought to make sense of this all. By the time he wrote, ethnic Arabs had almost totally lost control over the Islamic world, as North Africa was ruled by culturally Arabized but ethnic Berbers. Egypt was ruled by the Mamluk Burji dynasty of Circassian origin, a Caucasian hill tribe. The Ottoman Turks were becoming preeminent in Anatolia, and the great Turco-Mongol warlord, known in English as Tamerlane, was rampaging through the Muslim world. Ibn Khaldun created the paradigm of the cyclical rise and fall of dynasties, in which one dynasty becomes decadent and is replaced by a new wave of tough tribal people from the edges of civilization. In this view, the Arabs started out as a hardy yet primitive desert people, brought together by tribal loyalty known as Asabaya. They conquered their more advanced neighbors and became their rulers, but in doing so, the Arabs absorbed the decadence of civilization, and this became the seed of their own downfall. On a microcosmic scale, he noticed this happening in his own native North Africa during his lifetime, in which nomadic tribes from the North African hinterland would take over the coastal cities, only to assimilate into urban culture and be replaced by a new wave of nomadic conquerors, losing contact with the tribal loyalties that had put them into power in the first place. The rulers succumbed to the excess and luxury and were doomed to be supplanted by yet another wave of nomads from the hinterland. Although governed by its peculiarities, and certainly not applicable to all of human history, this theory remains a reasonably good explanation of medieval North African politics, and arguably later events in Islamic history, such as the rise and fall of the Safavid dynasty of early modern Persia. It is easy to see how the events of Dune are inspired by all of this. The freemen being united by Paul is quite clearly analogous to the Arabian tribes brought together by the Prophet Muhammad and later caliphs to conquer their more civilized neighbors, such as the Persians and Romans. Indeed, in Dune, the emperor is even called by the honorific title Padishah, the same title used by the historical Persian and then Ottoman leaders. Like the early Arabs, or the nomadic Berbers of North Africa, the freemen are a tough desert people, closely tied together by in-group loyalty, and very capable fighters. They're desert nomads, have a highly honor-based culture, and think of sedentary, water-fat peoples as decadent. Looking at the story from a broader perspective, what happens is that a conflict erupts between one noble house, Atreides, with another, Harkonnen, and the emperor. The patriarch of this house is killed, but his widow and son flee and join up with the nomads. Using these nomads, the son, Paul, builds up a base of support outside of the traditional order of his society. Using them, he avenges his father, overthrows the ruling emperor, and marries his daughter to secure his place as the new emperor. Take away the space opera elements, and this sequence of events could have easily happened in Earth's medieval or ancient history. As one side note, the inspiration from Ibn Khaldun is even evident from the Freeman use of the Kitab al-Abar, or Book of Lessons, a real book actually written by the Maghrebi philosopher. Finally, one of the most interesting aspects of Dune, I think, is the prominent role of religion. Most fascinatingly, it is not the metaphysical, supernatural, or transcendent aspects of religion which dominate the world of Dune. Rather, it is the worldly, paternal, and hierarchical parts of religion that define it. Specifically, Dune draws heavily from the Roman Catholic Church and Shia Islam, which are arguably the two most hierarchical religions in existence. I think Dune shows us a world where humanity could ultimately not evolve past its baser instincts and regressed back into feudalism and theocracy, instead of ascending to something more than human. But paradoxically, there is a certain comfort that the people of Dune still seem human, warts and all. Going back to Ibn Khaldun, although certainly a devout Muslim, he also understood the practical importance of Islam as a religion in tying the Arabs together in the early days of the Caliphate. And this importance of religion in providing structure is certainly demonstrated in Dune. Of course, if Dune was merely medieval Islamic history recycled in space, it would be far less compelling than it is. Thankfully, there is enough unique world building and inspiration from other sources that Dune does not feel like that. Ultimately, the deep but coherent historical inspirations in Dune is one thing that makes it stand out above other fantasy stories, and gives it a historical feel despite being set thousands of years in the future. At risk of beating a dead horse, this is one thing which differentiates it from Game of Thrones, which, although certainly inspired by various historical events, lacked a coherent worldview and ended in a way that didn't really say anything about anything. In order to make something feel historically inspired, I think that one has to choose a specific feeling to replicate, instead of just picking and choosing various elements, events, people, or places to make parallels with in the fictional story. By using Ibn Khaldun's theory of Asabaya so effectively, Dune feels timeless. With hope, all of this will help you to better appreciate the world of Dune when you see the next movie in theaters this fall, and better understand the rich background and context behind it.